I further had to spiral into an even darker place in a lot of ways for me to get to a point where I had to realize my need for God. It's not like walking with him over the last 14 years has been easy, but life with God is so much better and fuller and richer and freer than life without him.
Welcome to the Jesus Storybook Bible Podcast, a place where we remind you that grace can rewrite any story, that hope shines a light through our darkest moments, and that God's love changes lives. Here's your host, New York Times bestselling author, Sally Lloyd Jones.
Hello, I'm Sally Lloyd Jones, author of the Jesus Storybook Bible, which tells the story of God's never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Welcome to the show. Have you ever found yourself questioning, why would God let something like this happen? It's something that our guest this week, a podcast host, speaker and writer, struggled with as a young adult after witnessing her mum, a Vietnam War veteran, face some extremely difficult circumstances. Molly Stillman's mum was an army nurse who faced the challenges of PTSD after the war, and who then went on to achieve historic moments as an advocate for veterans, especially female veterans. Molly was able to witness firsthand the successes of her trailblazing mum, and when her mother eventually faced a harrowing illness, the result of her exposure to Agent Orange during the war, Molly found herself struggling with feelings of anger and asking, why would God let something like this happen? As Molly's life began to spiral, and without a faith foundation to guide her, it was at a rock-bottom moment and feeling desperate for change that Molly stepped foot inside a church one day. And she left filled with hope and the realization that she could put her trust and faith in God to help her find her joy again. I love the passage in Proverbs 17, verse 22, that says, "A joyful heart is good medicine." It's something that Molly lives by as she spreads joy through laughter in all that she does. So without further ado, please welcome my friend and now yours, Molly Stillman.
My name is Molly Stillman, and I am a wife to John. I'm a mom to Lily and Amos here on earth, and Elijah and Malachi in heaven. And we live on a small farm in Durham, North Carolina. And I also get the honor to write and speak, and I host a podcast called Can I Laugh on Your Shoulder? It's a wide range of things that I get to do. My mom went to Mercy Hospital School of Nursing in Baltimore, Maryland, and this was during the height of the Vietnam War in the late 60s. And the reality was that the Vietnam War wasn't really talked a lot about back home. The spring of 1968, an Army recruiter came to Mercy and talked about the need for nurses in Vietnam, and my mom was one of the first to enlist. So she enlisted in the Army in 1968 and then got her orders for Vietnam in June of 1969. Almost immediately upon arrival in Vietnam, the naivete that she had was gone, and she saw the brutality of war. And so she really was thrust into the darkness that was there day in and day out. They were told they were going to be working 12-hour shifts, but more often than not, especially if there was a mass casualty situation or a rocket attack, they would be working 24, 48, 72-hour shifts with, no sleep. So in a lot of ways, she saw the worst of the worst. And when she returned home, she returned to a country that was deeply divided over the war. At the time, there was no diagnosis or even really word for PTSD, and which she had a severe case of, as pretty much everybody who returned home from Vietnam did. And so there were no resources really to guide her along the way. A couple times she had tried to go to the VA for assistance and was just turned away because she was told that, women weren't in Vietnam. And so her entire service was even kind of being called into question. And she would go to rallies or marches with other veterans and be told that she can't march because, again, women didn't serve in Vietnam. And so this sent her down a pretty dark spiral of alcoholism and addiction. Her first marriage was kind of in shambles, and she was having a hard time keeping a job. She was working still in nursing, and she was an in-home dialysis nurse. Eventually, she and her first husband divorced. She returned to Vietnam in the early 80s as a part of a delegation sent by the U.S. to study the effects of Vietnam on women and children and veterans in general. And she was actually tasked to be the very first executive director of the Vietnam Veterans of America's Women's Project. In 1983, she got sober and she published her memoir, Home Before Morning, which was the very first account of a nonfiction account of the Vietnam War written by a woman. And she was, in a lot of ways, helping to tell the story of what really happened in Vietnam, while also in her own way exorcising the demons of the war from herself and from her mind. Fast forward a couple years and she meets my dad, and they actually got engaged on their second date and married 6 weeks later. I'm growing up in this home with two parents who are wildly in love and full of laughter and passion, and also facing deep challenges. My mom also is fighting for the rights of women veterans and helping to pave a path for the women who would come behind her. And I got a front row seat to it. And I went with her to, and watched her testify before Congress. And I watched her stand in a hot July day at the groundbreaking of the Vietnam Women's Memorial, standing next to Diane Carlson Evans and Senator John Kerry and General Colin Powell. And, I got to witness these, in a lot of ways, historic things as she was, again, paving a path for the military women who would come behind her. And she was just such a fierce advocate for them. But then in the fall of 1994, as she was really in a good place, healing from her pain of Vietnam, the war reared its ugly head again. She was diagnosed with an incredibly rare autoimmune disease due to her exposure to Agent Orange while she was in Vietnam. We spent months, years going to specialists and hospitals all over the country trying to pinpoint what was going on, because it was just a myriad of symptoms that she was experiencing. And eventually they landed on a diagnosis that gave her about 2 years to live. But ever the fighter that she was, she got 8 years and eventually succumbed to her illness on November 15th, 2002. My mom's death, in a lot of ways, was the catalyst for the rest of my life. I was a senior in high school. And so growing up, the daughter of this woman who was a trailblazer and full of life and love, but also watching her face an incredibly difficult and dark battle. I really struggled. I didn't have a faith foundation to guide me, and I was in a pretty dark place pretty quickly. And in a lot of ways, I was very angry with God because I saw this woman who so fiercely loved others and fought so hard. And I saw her pray. And a lot of times I questioned, why would God let something like this happen? On my 21st birthday, I was at the peak of my young adult game. I was student body president. I was in a sorority. I had a great boyfriend. I was in a campus sketch comedy group. For all intents and purposes, I was killing it. And I'd created this kind of facade that if I make everything look great on the outside, then I'll actually be that way on the inside, even though I'd all this pent up grief and all of these root issues that I had never dealt with after the death of my mom and her being sick for so long. That 21st birthday, I get a certified letter in the mail, and inside that certified letter was a stack of papers. And on top of that stack of papers was a check for just shy of $250,000. It was a surprise inheritance from my mom's estranged family's estate. I was not prepared for it. And, truth be told, what happens when you give $250,000 to a grieving, immature 21-year-old? Only great things. And so all of a sudden I went from having no money to having a lot of money. And I used it in a lot of ways as a coping mechanism, and the adrenaline rush and the dopamine hits I would get from, going and buying a new car, or flying first class to Rome for spring break, or, just death by 1,000 cuts quickly spiraled out of control. And less than 2 years later, in June of 2008, I found myself not only having spent every last dime, but I was over $36,000 in consumer credit card debt. I had felt so guilty and so much shame and embarrassment over the situation that I'd gotten myself into. And so that really even furthered my isolation and not wanting anyone to know what I was going through, what I had done. Eventually, I was living in North Carolina. I was working 4 jobs, trying to get out of debt. I had just gotten out of a very unhealthy relationship. My self-esteem was at an all-time low. And I had finally gotten to the point where I had to come face to face with my own darkness and the place that I had gotten myself into. God had to continue to strip away everything I had placed my faith in. I had to get to a place where I was at emotional, mental, spiritual, physical rock bottom in order to really understand my need for God. In September of 2010, I got to a point where I realized I've got to try something else. I asked the guy that I was kind of hanging out with, let's just say, spoiler alert, I'm married to him now, but I asked him if I could go to church with him. And I stepped foot in that church that day, desperate for change, desperate for something different. And I heard the gospel for the first time. And I heard that there was a God in heaven who loved me, who created me on purpose and with a purpose and for a purpose, and that there was no part of my story that was too far gone or too broken. I left that church that day with hope. And when you give hope to a hopeless person, that's a really, really powerful, powerful thing. I've only been walking with the Lord for 14 years. The Jesus Storybook Bible really helped me to see God's story as one beautiful, perfect story from start to finish. Stories harken back to one another, and it's beautiful. We have purchased probably close to a dozen copies of the Jesus Storybook Bible over the years. We have read through it together as a family so much that our book ends up falling apart. And it's actually one that my husband and I both recommend to newer believers. I'll be reading from a story in the Jesus Storybook Bible called Daniel and the Scary Sleepover, which tells the story of Daniel and the lion's den from Daniel 6. They smiled to themselves. Let's get the king to make a law. No one is allowed to pray to anyone except to the king. Daniel won't obey this law, and he will be punished. Daniel heard this. He knew it was wrong to pray to anyone except God. He had to do what God said, whatever it cost him, even if it meant he would die. So Daniel went to his room, closed the door, and prayed. That's just what the bad men knew Daniel would do. They skipped straight off to tell the king. The king was sad. He had been tricked. He didn't want to hurt Daniel, but he couldn't change his law. And so he let the soldiers throw Daniel to the lions. May your God, who you love so much, rescue you, the king said. The king went back to his palace, but he didn't sleep that night, not a wink. He tossed and turned until finally, at the first glimmer of dawn, he leaped out of bed and ran straight to the den. Daniel, he cried, has your God rescued you? Yes, Daniel shouted. God sent an angel to close the lions' mouths. And there, resting his head on Daniel's lap, was the biggest lion, purring like a little kitten. The king brought Daniel out of the den. Look, he said, Daniel doesn't even have a scratch. The king made a new law. Daniel's God is the true God, the God who rescues. Pray to him instead. God would keep on rescuing his people. And the time was coming when God would send another brave hero like Daniel, who would love God and do what God said, whatever it cost him, even if it meant he would die. And together they would pull off the greatest rescue the world has ever known.
You can get the Jesus Storybook Bible wherever books are sold. To find out more about the book and all of Sally's other books, please visit Sally at sallylloyd-jones.com and follow her on Instagram at Sally Lloyd Jones and at Jesus_Storybook_Bible.
Before we go, don't forget, God loves you with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. Oh, hello, it's me again, Sally. I'm just popping back briefly to say two things. The first thing is, don't forget to subscribe to the show, because that way you'll get the stories straight to your phone. And the other thing is, while we're at it, would you rate the show and leave us a review? That would be so great, because it helps other people find the show too. I really appreciate your help. Thank you.